Her fingers, chapped and raw from the relentless wind, trembled. She clutched the last relic of her former life, a simple gold band. Once, it was a symbol of endless love. Now, it was just a bargaining chip for a piece of bread. In a town where hope had dried up like a riverbed, Rosalie Vance offered her past for a chance at a future. But when she was met with cold refusal, a voice cut through the silence. Deep, steady, like the mountains themselves. It belonged to a man with eyes that saw more than just a desperate woman. They saw a flicker of fire that had yet to be extinguished, and his words would change everything. "Gold isn't what we need," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. "You are." What could he possibly mean? What did he see in her? And what secret was his family hiding that made a starving stranger more valuable than gold? The answer lies buried in the heart of a struggling ranch, a bitter feud, and a love that would be forged in the unforgiving crucible of the Wild West. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about uncovering a hidden truth that could save a family or doom them all. Rosalie felt the grit of Redemption Gulch under the thin, worn soles of her boots. It was a texture she knew intimately, the fine, pervasive dust that settled on everything. A constant reminder of a land that promised prosperity but delivered mostly thirst. The town itself was a scar, a single wide street gouged between raw-timbered buildings. Their false fronts leaned against the vast, indifferent blue sky of the Montana Territory like tired old men. Each gust of wind carried the scent of horse, sweat, stale whiskey, and the faint, heartbreaking smell of baking bread from a saloon she couldn't afford to enter. Her stomach was a hollow, aching cavern, twisted with a hunger so profound it had become a part of her. It had been 3 days since her last proper meal, a shared stale biscuit with a family heading east, fleeing the very dream she was chasing. They had looked at her with pity, a lone woman, too pale and too finely dressed, even in her now tattered traveling suit, for this harsh country. Her husband, Robert, had died of fever just 200 miles back. His dreams of a new life in the West were buried with him under a crude wooden cross. Everything they had owned was gone, sold for medicine that didn't work, and passage that led her to this dead end. All she had left was the ring. It was a simple gold band, warmed by the memory of Robert's hand placing it on her finger in a sun-dappled chapel back in Boston. Her last connection to a life of books, soft linens, and polite conversation. Now its smooth weight was an anchor dragging her down. She pushed open the door to the general store. A bell above it gave a tiny, cheerless jingle. The air inside was thick with the competing aromas of dried beans, cured leather, and chewing tobacco. A portly man with a magnificent gray mustache and suspenders stretched taut over his belly stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. He eyed her entrance with the practiced disinterest of a man who saw desperation walk through his door a dozen times a day. "Help you?" he grunted, his voice as dry as the floorboards. Rosalie approached the counter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt the eyes of 2 grizzled prospectors by the stove on her back, their gazes as rough as their calloused hands. She had to swallow twice before her own voice would work. "Sir, I have no money," she began, the words tasting of shame. "But I have this. It's pure gold. I was hoping to trade it for some provisions. Just enough to get by. Some flour, bacon, coffee." She slid the ring from her finger. The motion felt like a betrayal, a final severing. She placed it on the rough-hewn wood of the counter. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a tiny sun of a forgotten world. The store owner, a Mr. Fincher, picked it up. He pinched it between a thick thumb and forefinger, holding it close to his eye. Then he tossed it onto the counter, where it landed with a small metallic click that echoed the closing of a door in Rosalie's soul. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Got no use for gold trinkets. Can't eat 'em, can't plant 'em, and the men who have coin to spare for such things ain't interested in a plain little thing like that. They want flash." He gestured with his head toward a locked case containing gaudy brooches and silver-plated buckles. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned back to his jar. Tears pricked at Rosalie's eyes, hot and furious. She had endured so much grief, fear, exhaustion. But this casual dismissal, this declaration that her last piece of dignity was worthless, felt like the cruelest blow. The prospectors snickered into their beards. Humiliation washed over her, a cold tide. She reached for the ring, her hand shaking. Perhaps the lady would be willing to trade for other services. One of the prospectors drawled, a leering grin spreading across his face. Before Rosalie could react, before the fury could even find its voice, the store's door opened again. A long rectangle of blinding sunlight cut across the floor. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. He moved with a quiet confidence that instantly silenced the room. When he stepped inside, his features came into focus. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-streaked brown hair and a face that looked as if it were carved from the landscape itself, all sharp angles and steady planes. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling shade of gray, the color of a stormy sky, and they missed nothing. He took in the scene in a single glance. Rosalie, pale and trembling, the leering prospector, the dismissive shopkeeper, the lonely gold ring on the counter. His gaze lingered on Rosalie for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He walked to the counter, his worn leather boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the floor. He ignored the others and spoke directly to Mr. Fincher. "A sack of flour, 20 pounds of beans, a side of bacon, and a tin of your best coffee, Fincher." His voice was a low baritone, calm but carrying an undeniable authority. He placed a few heavy coins on the counter that made a sound far more convincing than her ring had. Then he turned his storm-gray eyes to Rosalie. He nodded toward the ring. "Is that yours?" She could only nod, her throat tight. He looked at Fincher, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "A woman comes in here, clearly in need, and you turn her away?" Fincher sputtered, his face reddening. "Now see here, Nate. Business is business. I ain't a charity." The man named Nate held Fincher's gaze until the store owner looked away, suddenly finding his polished jar fascinating again. Nate looked back at Rosalie, his expression softening. He picked up her ring, but instead of examining it like a merchant, he held it carefully in his palm, as if it were a fragile bird. "My father's ranch, Sterling Creek, is a day's ride west of here," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "We could use a hand. It's not easy work, but it's honest. A roof over your head, 3 meals a day." Rosalie stared at him, bewildered, a stranger offering charity. Her pride, though battered, was still alive. "I can't accept," she whispered. "I have nothing to pay you with." He closed his hand over her ring, and then gently, incredibly, took her own hand and pressed the ring back into her palm, closing her fingers around it. The warmth of his touch was a shock, a spark of life in the cold numbness of her despair. He looked directly into her eyes, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "Gold isn't what we need, ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, carrying a weight she couldn't yet comprehend. "You are." And just like that, her entire world shifted. The journey to Sterling Creek was made mostly in silence, a silence that felt more thoughtful than awkward. Nathaniel Sterling, or Nate, as he'd introduced himself, was not a man given to idle chatter. He rode a powerful ranch gelding with an easy ingrained grace, leading a pack mule laden with the provisions he'd purchased. He had insisted Rosalie ride his horse while he walked alongside, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that felt jarringly out of place in the rugged landscape. Rosalie perched uncomfortably on the wide saddle, watching the terrain shift. The dusty plains around Redemption Gulch gave way to rolling foothills carpeted in sagebrush and dotted with hardy pines. The mountains loomed closer, their peaks like jagged teeth against the endless sky. Nate pointed out landmarks with a spare economy of words. Crow's Peak, Devil's Wash, the stand of aspens that marked the beginning of his family's land. Her mind replayed his strange words from the store. "You are what we need." What could he possibly mean? She was a widow, a destitute traveler. She could read and write, play the pianoforte, and manage a household staff, skills as useless here as a silk fan in a blizzard. Was he simply a kind man taking pity on her? Or was there something else? Something hidden beneath that stoic exterior? The answer, she realized, was still out there, waiting for her. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Nate stopped. "We're here." Before them lay a wide, green valley, a startling splash of life cradled by the surrounding hills. A creek, the Sterling Creek, she presumed, snaked through it like a silver ribbon. In the center of the valley stood the ranch. It was larger than she had imagined, with a long, low main house built of sturdy timber and stone, a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a web of corrals. But as they drew closer, she saw the signs of hardship Nate's confident demeanor had hidden. The main house needed a new coat of paint, its porch railings were splintered, and a section of fence around a distant pasture had collapsed, the posts lying on the ground like fallen soldiers. The place had strong bones, but it was weary, as if it was sighing under the weight of a long struggle. This wasn't just a home, it was a ghost. A young woman, barely 16, burst from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She had the same sun-streaked hair as Nate, but her eyes were a warm, gentle brown. Her face, etched with worry, broke into a relieved smile at the sight of them. "Nate, you're back. Father was getting worried." Her eyes fell on Rosalie, and her smile faltered, replaced by wide-eyed curiosity. "Penny, this is Mrs. Rosalie Vance," Nate said, his voice softening as he spoke to his sister. "She'll be staying with us for a while, helping out." Penelope, or Penny, gave a small, shy curtsy. "A pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Just then, the front door opened again, and an older man stepped onto the porch. He was tall like his son, but where Nate was solid and vital, this man was gaunt. His shoulders stooped, as if carrying an invisible burden. His hair was completely gray, and his face was a road map of deep lines. His eyes, the same stormy gray as Nate's, held a profound sadness. This had to be Harrison Sterling, the patriarch. He looked at Rosalie, his gaze sharp and questioning. "Nathaniel, who is this?" "This is Mrs. Vance, father," Nate said, his tone respectful but firm. "I've hired her. She'll be helping Penny with the household and the books." Harrison's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Rosalie's worn but still genteel attire. "Hired her? With what, son? We can barely afford the hands we have." "We're affording it," Nate stated simply, a silent challenge passing between father and son. Harrison's shoulders slumped a little more, and he retreated back into the house without another word, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. What was going on here? Later that evening, after a simple but blessedly hot meal of beans and bacon, the truth of Nate's words began to unfold. Penny, with the artless honesty of youth, explained the situation as she showed Rosalie to a small but clean room with a single bed and a washstand. "Mama's been unwell for a long time," Penny said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Her lungs are weak. She can't do much anymore. And Papa, he hasn't been the same since my brother Daniel died." She gestured vaguely towards the hills. "A riding accident 2 years back. Papa was with him. He blames himself. He used to be so strong, so full of life. Now it's like the heart's gone out of him." The pieces began to click into place. A sick mother, a grieving broken father. All the responsibility of this massive, struggling ranch had fallen onto Nate's shoulders. The final shocking piece was revealed by Nate himself. After Penny had gone to bed, he found Rosalie on the front porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl against the cool night air. The sky was a riot of stars, more brilliant than any she had ever seen in the smoke-hazed skies of Boston. "I apologize for my father," he began, leaning against a porch post. "He's slow to trust these days." "Your sister explained about your brother," Rosalie said softly. "I'm very sorry." Nate was silent for a long moment, his profile stark against the starlight. "Daniel was the light of this family. When he died, something in my father broke. He lost faith. He made bad deals, trusted the wrong people. A man named Bartholomew Corian, who owns the ranch to the east, took advantage. He's been bleeding us dry, buying up our debt, trying to force us out." He finally turned to face her, his gray eyes intense. "The last bookkeeper we hired, a man from town, was in Corian's pocket. He cooked the books, made it look like we were deeper in the hole than we were. I found out, but not before the damage was done. We can't trust anyone from Redemption Gulch. They're all either scared of Corian or on his payroll." He paused, and the full weight of his proposition settled on her. "I saw you in that store today," he continued, his voice lower now. "I saw your face when Fincher refused you. You were desperate, but you weren't grasping. You have an education. I can tell by the way you speak. You carry yourself with a dignity that hasn't been broken, even when you have nothing. You're an outsider. You have no loyalty to Corian. You needed a refuge, and I need someone I can trust to make sense of this mess. Someone who can read a ledger and see the lies." He gestured to the vast, dark valley around them. "This land is my mother's heart and my father's soul. I will not lose it." Rosalie looked down at her hand, where the faint impression of her ring still seemed to linger. He hadn't seen just a destitute widow. He had seen a bookkeeper, a manager, an ally. He hadn't been offering charity. He had been offering a post, a purpose. "Gold isn't what we need," she repeated, her own echo of his earlier words, understanding dawning on her face. "We need honesty. We need a mind that isn't for sale." "I'm gambling that you're that person, Mrs. Vance." For the first time since Robert's death, a flicker of something other than fear ignited within Rosalie. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. It was purpose. "Please," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Call me Rosalie." A quiet rebellion had just begun. Life at Sterling Creek settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Rosalie's days began before dawn, the air crisp and cold, the world painted in shades of gray and lavender. She learned the simple, grounding rituals of ranch life. The taste of strong black coffee brewed over a wood stove, the smell of baking bread, the lowing of cattle in the distance. She took over the household duties from Penny, insisting the young girl focus on her studies. In the afternoons, she would sit at the heavy oak desk in Harrison Sterling's disused office, surrounded by stacks of dusty ledgers. The books were a disaster. It was a tangled story of debt, high-interest loans, and suspicious sales receipts, all pointing back to one man, Bartholomew Corian. He was a phantom menace, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment by the few loyal hands who remained on the ranch. Rosalie knew she had to expose him, but how? 2 weeks into her stay, the phantom took on flesh. Rosalie was outside, hanging laundry on a line strung between two poles, the clean, wet scent of lye soap filling the air. She saw two riders approaching, not from the direction of town, but from the east. One was a hulking, slovenly man with a perpetually surly expression. The other, however, commanded attention. He was impeccably dressed for a cattleman in a tailored black coat and a fine felt hat. He was handsome in a predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes as cold and black as river stones. He rode his horse like he owned the very ground it stood on. Nate intercepted them before they reached the house, his stance casual, but his body taut as a coiled spring. Rosalie found herself frozen, her hand clutching a damp bedsheet, unable to look away. "Corian," Nate said, his voice flat and devoid of greeting. "You're on my land." "Just a neighborly visit, Sterling," Corian replied, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that slid over the skin like a snake. "Checking to see if you've come to your senses about my offer." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is a lot of land for a broken-down old man and one boy to handle. I'm prepared to be generous. Take it off your hands, relieve you of your debts. The only debt I'm concerned with is the one you manufactured with your crooked bookkeeper," Nate shot back, his voice dangerously low. "This ranch isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever." Corian's smile vanished. "Pride is an expensive luxury, Sterling, one I don't think you can afford." His cold eyes swept over the ranch, lingering on the peeling paint and the dilapidated fence. Then his gaze found Rosalie. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising stare that made her feel like a piece of livestock at auction. "Well, well, it seems you found a new asset, though I can't imagine what you're paying her with." The insult was clear, crude, and meant to provoke. Rosalie's face burned with shame and anger. Nate took a half-step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "This is Mrs. Vance, our bookkeeper," Nate said, his voice laced with ice. "And you will show her respect. Now get off my land before I forget what neighborly means." Corian chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "As you wish, but my offer stands. When the wolves are at your door, and they will be, you'll remember my generosity." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness toward Rosalie, then wheeled his horse around and rode away, his heavy-set companion trailing behind him. The encounter left a palpable tension in the air. The threat was no longer just numbers in a ledger. It had a face, a voice, and a chilling promise. The very next day, the shadow of that threat began to fall across the ranch in earnest. One of the ranch hands, a seasoned cowboy named Gus, rode in with a grim expression. "Fences down again, Nate, by the north pasture, cut clean through. Herd scattered all to hell." It took Nate and the other two hands the entire day to round up the cattle. While they were gone, Rosalie discovered the next problem. She went to the well for water, but the bucket came up smelling foul, coated in a greasy chemical slime. Someone had deliberately poisoned the well closest to the house. It wasn't lethal, but it was undrinkable, forcing them to haul water from the creek, a time-consuming and back-breaking task. Each incident was a small cut, designed to bleed them of time, energy, and morale. Harrison Sterling seemed to shrink with each new setback, retreating further into his silent grief. He would sit on the porch for hours, staring at the hills where his younger son had died, his spirit eroding like the soft rock of a canyon wall. But the adversity had an unintended effect on Rosalie. The fear that had paralyzed her in Redemption Gulch was slowly being burned away by a simmering anger. This was her home now. These people, the quiet, steadfast Nate, the sweet and hopeful Penny, even the broken Harrison, were her family. The attack on Sterling Creek felt like an attack on her, and she was done being a victim. One evening, as she was poring over the ledgers by lamplight, her eyes aching, Nate came in and set a steaming mug of coffee beside her. He looked exhausted, his face smudged with dirt, and his shoulders slumped with the weight of the day's work. "Find anything?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "More of the same," she said, pointing to a column of figures. "This is a receipt for 50 head of cattle sold to Corian last fall. The price is a third of what they were worth. Your father's signature is on it, but it looks shaky. Forced." She looked up at him. "He's been doing this for 2 years, hasn't he? Small things, cutting fences, spooking herds, sabotaging equipment. And then, when your father is at his lowest, he appears with a low-ball offer or a high-interest loan. He's not a rancher, he's a vulture." Nate nodded grimly, staring into the flickering flame of the lamp. "He's patient. He thinks he can just wait for us to break." "Then we can't break," Rosalie said, a fierce determination hardening her voice. She looked from the ledger to his tired face. "We have to fight back, Nate. Not with fists or guns, but with this." She tapped the ledger. "There has to be a mistake in here. A lie big enough to expose him for the cheat he is." Nate looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the weary rancher. She saw a glimmer of the man he might have been before his brother's death, before the weight of the world had settled on him. It was a look of surprise, of respect, and of a shared, burgeoning hope. "All right, Mrs. Bookkeeper," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Let's find his lie." In that moment, they were no longer just an employer and an employee, a rescuer and a victim. They were partners. And in the heart of the beleaguered Sterling Creek Ranch, a quiet rebellion had just begun. The days that followed were a silent war waged with ink and paper. Rosalie worked relentlessly, her fingers becoming smudged with black ink, her mind a maze of numbers, dates, and signatures. She compiled a new, clean ledger, cross-referencing every sale, every purchase, every loan agreement. With Nate's help, she began to unravel the intricate web of deceit Corian had woven around Harrison Sterling. Nate would come in late at night after the endless work of the ranch was done and sit across from her at the desk. He would explain the intricacies of cattle pricing, water rights, and land deeds. She, in turn, would explain the language of accounting, showing him how a misplaced decimal or a forged signature could steal a man's legacy. In the quiet intimacy of the lamplit office, sharing coffee and a common purpose, a bond formed between them, strong and unspoken. She saw the quick intelligence behind his weary eyes, the deep love he had for his family, and the stubborn pride that refused to let him fail. He, in turn, saw the sharp mind and resilient spirit that her genteel background had concealed. He started calling her Rosalie, without the formal Mrs. Vance, and the sound of her name on his lips felt both natural and strangely thrilling. This unspoken connection was about to be put to the ultimate test. One afternoon, chasing a stray calf, Penny took Rosalie to a secluded part of the property, a small canyon carved by the creek. At its heart was a grove of cottonwood trees and a simple, rough-hewn cross. "This is where it happened," Penny said softly. "This is where Daniel fell." Rosalie stood in respectful silence, imagining the terrible scene. She looked at the cross, then at the surrounding terrain. The canyon walls were steep, the ground rocky and treacherous. "Papa says he should have known better," Penny whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He said Daniel was showing off, riding too fast, and he didn't stop him. He says he just watched him fall. He carried him all the way back to the house, but it was too late." The story, told in that quiet, sad place, gave a new depth to Harrison's grief. It wasn't just sorrow, it was a profound, soul-crushing guilt. He wasn't just a broken man. He was a man who believed he had failed in his most fundamental duty as a father. Rosalie's heart ached for him. She returned to the ledgers with renewed vigor. This wasn't just about saving a ranch anymore. It was about restoring a family, about giving a good man a reason to look up from his grief and fight again. And what she found next would shake everything to its core. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon, a week later. Rosalie was examining a large, official-looking document, the original deed for the Sterling Creek property, signed by Nate's grandfather. Beneath it was a more recent loan agreement with Bartholomew Corian, secured against the entire ranch. The collateral was everything they had. The terms were predatory, the interest rate astronomical. Harrison's signature at the bottom was a barely legible scrawl. But something else caught her eye. It was a map attached to the original deed, outlining the property lines. It was old and faded, the lines drawn in a spidery hand. She compared it to a more recent survey map that had been filed with the loan. For the most part, they matched. But in the far northeastern corner of the property, a rugged, seemingly useless stretch of badlands, the line on the new map was different. It had been subtly redrawn, ceding a small, L-shaped parcel of land to Corian's adjacent property. It was only a few acres, worthless rocky land. Why would Corian bother to alter a deed for a patch of dust and rock? This made no sense. This was the twist. She showed it to Nate that night. He frowned, tracing the altered property line with his finger. The North Spur. That's what my grandfather called it. It's good for nothing. Can't graze it. Can't farm it. It's just a maze of canyons and rocks. Why would he want it? It has to be important, Rosalie insisted. People like Corian don't do things without a reason that involves profit. A thought struck Nate. My grandfather used to talk about that land. He said it held a secret. My father always dismissed it as old man's foolishness. Something about the heart of the valley. The phrase hung in the air between them. The heart of the valley. It sounded like something from a storybook, not a land dispute. We need to ride out there, Nate said, his eyes alight with a new fire. We need to see what he's trying to steal from us. The next morning, as the sky was just beginning to pale from black to purple, they rode out. They didn't tell Harrison or Penny where they were going, not wanting to raise false hopes. The air was cool and clean, and the sound of their horses' hooves was the only disturbance in the vast silence. What they were about to discover would change everything they thought they knew. As they rode, Nate spoke of his brother Daniel, not of his death, but of his life. He told Rosalie how Daniel had been the wild one, full of laughter and daring, the one who could charm a bird from a tree. He spoke of how he, Nate, had always been the serious, responsible one, the protector. I was supposed to be watching him that day, Nate confessed, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. I was mending a fence on the west pasture. Father took him out alone. If I had been there, maybe I could have stopped him. Maybe I would have seen the loose rock on the trail. It was the same crushing guilt that was consuming his father. Rosalie reached out and briefly touched his arm. You can't carry that, Nate. It wasn't your fault. He just shook his head, unable to accept the absolution. They reached the North Spur by mid-morning. It was just as Nate had described, a desolate landscape of sun-bleached rock and thorny scrub. They dismounted and began to explore on foot, following a dry, winding creek bed that snaked through a narrow canyon. The sun beat down, and the heat radiating from the rocks was intense. They walked for nearly an hour, finding nothing. The silence was oppressive. Rosalie was about to suggest they turn back when she noticed it. A patch of green against the uniform beige and brown of the canyon. It was a startling anomaly. It was a cluster of ferns and moss, impossibly lush, growing from a fissure in the canyon wall. Water, dark and cool, was weeping from the rock, gathering in a small, clear pool below. Nate stopped dead, his eyes wide with disbelief. He knelt by the pool, dipping his hand into the water. "It's cold," he breathed, a look of awe on his face. "Sweet." He looked up at the rock face, tracing the line of the fissure. "A spring," he whispered, "a year-round spring on this side of the mountain." Rosalie understood instantly. In a land where water was more precious than gold, a permanent, hidden spring was a treasure beyond measure. It was the lifeblood of the land. It could irrigate fields, water thousands of head of cattle, sustain a ranch through the driest of droughts. This was the heart of the valley. This was the secret Corian was after. He didn't just want their land. He wanted their water, the very source of life in the region. The forged deed wasn't about a few worthless acres of rock. It was a brazen attempt to steal the most valuable asset in the entire territory. "He knows," Rosalie said, her voice a mixture of horror and triumph. "He knows this is here, and he thinks he's already stolen it." Nate stood up, his face set like granite. The grief and exhaustion that had clung to him for so long seemed to evaporate in the heat of the canyon, replaced by a cold, hard fury. "He hasn't stolen anything yet," he said, his gray eyes glinting like steel. "He just showed us his weak spot, and now we know exactly where to hit him." The battle was on, and this time, they had the upper hand. The discovery of the spring changed everything. It was no longer a defensive battle to simply survive. It was now a fight to reclaim a stolen birthright. The knowledge of Corian's true motive lit a fire under the Sterling family. For the first time since Rosalie's arrival, a current of unified purpose ran through the weary ranch house. When Nate and Rosalie returned and explained what they had found, Harrison Sterling listened, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly gave way to a dawning, incredulous hope. He unearthed old journals of his father's, filled with cryptic references to the living water and the vein of the earth. What he had dismissed as poetic rambling was in fact a careful coded record of the spring's existence. "He never told me exactly where it was," Harrison murmured, his voice rough with disuse and regret, tracing the faded script with a trembling finger. "Some treasures are best kept secret until they are needed most. He feared a water rush, men killing each other over it." He looked up at Nate, his eyes clearer than they had been in 2 years. "Corian must have found one of these journals, or tortured the information out of one of the old hands." A new energy took hold of Harrison. The guilt that had stooped his shoulders seemed to lessen, replaced by the righteous anger of a man who has been profoundly wronged. He started working alongside Nate and the other hands, his movements still stiff and slow, but filled with a resolve that had long been absent. He was fighting for more than just land now. He was fighting for his father's legacy and his son's future. The Sterlings were back, and Corian had no idea what was coming. Their strategy was twofold. First, they had to secure proof of ownership. Rosalie spent hours carefully tracing the original deed map onto a new sheet of parchment, highlighting the correct, unaltered property line. She meticulously documented every fraudulent charge and forged signature in Corian's ledgers, creating a damning portfolio of his crimes. Second, they had to prepare for Corian's reaction. They knew that once he realized they had uncovered his secret, he would not react with legal challenges. He would react with force. Nate, Gus, and the other hands, a wiry cowboy named Shorty, and a young, eager man called Billy, began to work with grim efficiency. They repaired every section of fence, cleaned and oiled their rifles, and took turns standing watch at night. The ranch, which had felt so vulnerable, began to feel like a fortress. During this time, the quiet moments between Rosalie and Nate grew more charged. One evening, As they stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, the unspoken feelings that had been simmering between them rose to the surface. "I don't know what we would have done without you, Rosalie," Nate said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at the horizon, as if the words were too immense to be spoken face to face. "You would have found a way," she replied softly. "You're a fighter, Nate." "I was tired of fighting," he admitted. "Before you came, I was just holding on, trying not to drown. You didn't just find the lies in the books. You reminded us what we were fighting for." He finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the twilight. "You reminded me." The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with Bartholomew Corian. It was the pull of two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos. Two solitudes that had merged into a shared strength. He took a step closer, and Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet electric, a question and an answer all at once. The moment was shattered by a frantic shout from the barn. "Fire, Nate, fire!" They both spun around. Billows of thick black smoke were pouring from the roof of the main barn. Flames licked at the dry timber, casting a hellish orange glow against the deepening night sky. Sabotage. Corian was done with his subtle war of attrition. This was an open declaration. This was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. Panic and adrenaline surged through Rosalie. Nate was already moving, shouting orders. "Gus, Shorty, get the horses out. Billy, form a bucket brigade from the creek. Father, get Penny and Mrs. Sterling somewhere safe." The ranch exploded into organized chaos. Men shouted, horses whinnied in terror, and the roar of the fire grew louder, a hungry beast consuming their livelihood. Rosalie, her heart pounding, joined the bucket brigade. She ran back and forth from the creek, her fine dress soaked and smudged with soot, her arms aching from the weight of the heavy pails. She worked alongside Penny, their faces grim and determined in the flickering firelight. The heat was blistering, and the smoke was a choking blanket. Sparks rained down, and the terrible sound of cracking, groaning timber filled the air. They focused their efforts on keeping the flames from spreading to the main house and the other outbuildings. The barn itself was a lost cause, a raging inferno against the dark sky. Nate was everywhere at once, a silhouette of calm authority amidst the panic. He was on the roof of the stables, dousing embers with water they passed up to him. He was leading panicked horses from their stalls, his voice a low, soothing rumble. He was the unshakable center of the storm. Hours passed in a desperate, lung-searing blur. Finally, as the first hint of dawn appeared in the east, the fire began to die down. The barn was gone. A blackened, skeletal frame stood against the pale sky, tendrils of smoke still rising from the smoldering ruins. The ground was a sea of mud and ash. They had saved the other buildings, but the loss of the barn and the winter hay stored within it was a devastating blow. They stood together, a small, exhausted, soot-stained group, watching the sun rise on the wreckage. Harrison Sterling had his arms around his wife, who had come out onto the porch wrapped in a thick blanket, and his daughter. His face was a mask of grim resolve. The fire had been meant to break them, but it seemed to have burned away the last vestiges of his despair, forging it into steel. Nate walked over to Rosalie. His face was black with soot, his shirt was torn, but his eyes were clear and hard. He looked at the ruined barn, then at her. "He's getting desperate," Nate said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "This isn't the move of a man who is confident he's going to win. This is the move of a man who's afraid he's about to lose everything." Rosalie looked at the determined faces of the family around her, at the loyal hands who had fought beside them all night, and she felt a surge of pride and belonging that overwhelmed her exhaustion. Then let's not keep him waiting, she said, her voice steady. They all knew what had to be done. The fight could no longer be contained to the ledgers and fence lines of Sterling Creek. It was time to take the battle to Redemption Gulch. It was time for a reckoning. The ride into town felt different this time. Rosalie was no longer the desperate, starving widow who had crept into Redemption Gulch weeks ago. She sat tall in a borrowed saddle on a steady mare, a satchel containing the meticulously organized evidence of Corian's fraud resting securely behind her. She rode beside Nate, who was flanked by his father and their 3 ranch hands. They were not a posse seeking vigilante justice. They were a family seeking righteous restitution. Their faces set with a quiet, unshakable purpose. The town buzzed with news of the Sterling's barn fire. As they rode down the main street, people stopped to stare. Whispers followed them like a trail of dust. They saw pity in some faces, fear in others, and cold indifference in many. They knew this was a town living under Corian's thumb. Their destination was the office of the town sheriff, a man named Brody, who Rosalie knew from her research was deeply in Corian's debt. The sheriff's office was a small, grimy building with a barred window and a sign that hung slightly askew. Sheriff Brody was a paunchy man with a stained vest and shifty, watery eyes. He looked up from his desk, a flicker of panic crossing his face when he saw the 6 of them fill his doorway. Bartholomew Corian was sitting in a chair opposite the desk, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking perfectly at ease. The scene confirmed every suspicion. This was not a meeting of law and order. It was a meeting of co-conspirators. "Well, well, Sterling," Corian said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Come to report a bit of bad luck? I heard about your barn. A terrible shame. Dry lightning, I suppose." "We both know lightning had nothing to do with it, Corian," Nate said, his voice dangerously calm. He stepped forward and placed the heavy satchel on the sheriff's desk. "We're here to file a formal complaint for arson, for cattle rustling, and for fraud." Rosalie stepped forward, opening the satchel. She laid out the documents one by one: the forged loan agreement, the doctored sales receipts, the 2 maps of the property, the original and the fraudulent one. "This is a copy of the original deed to the Sterling Creek Ranch, Sheriff," Rosalie explained, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear churning in her stomach. "And this is the map filed with the loan Corian holds. As you can see, the property line has been illegally altered to grant Mr. Corian ownership of a section of land known as the North Spur." Corian's smile tightened. Sheriff Brody licked his lips, his eyes darting from the papers to Corian's face. "This land contains a freshwater spring," Rosalie continued, her voice rising to be heard by the small crowd that was beginning to gather at the open door, drawn by the confrontation. A spring Corian intended to steal, bankrupting the Sterlings in the process to gain a monopoly on the water in this entire valley. A murmur went through the crowd. Water was everyone's concern. This accusation was far more serious than a simple land dispute. Corian laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "This is absurd. The woman is hysterical. These are just papers. My deal with Harrison Sterling was perfectly legal. He was a desperate man making a desperate deal. Isn't that right, Harrison?" He turned his cruel gaze on the older man, expecting to see the broken shell he had tormented for 2 years. But the man who met his gaze was not the Harrison Sterling he knew. This Harrison stood tall, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The only thing I was, Bartholomew, was grief-stricken, and you took advantage of that grief, like a coyote picking at a corpse. You preyed on my family. You preyed on my weakness. But that ends today." Harrison's voice boomed with a long-lost authority, and the crowd outside grew silent, listening intently. Sheriff Brody, sweating profusely, finally spoke. "Now see here, this is a civil matter. It's just your word against his." There's no proof of any wrongdoing. Isn't there, Sheriff? Nate said, turning his piercing gray eyes on the lawman. We have a sworn affidavit from a man in Cheyenne, a master forger. He describes in detail how Bartholomew Corian paid him to alter the Sterling's deed map and practice forging Harrison Sterling's signature. He felt so guilty about it, he was willing to testify. This was a bluff, but it was a masterful one. Rosalie watched, amazed, as a flicker of genuine terror crossed Corian's face. He knew he had hired such a man. He had no way of knowing if Nate was telling the truth. Corian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His mask of civility was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure malice. This is a lie, a desperate fabrication. I won't stand here and be slandered by this bankrupt family and their book reading. In a flash, Nate crossed the room. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed the front of Corian's fine coat, lifting the bigger man half out of his boots, and slammed him against the wall. The impact shook the entire building. You will not speak to her that way, Nate snarled, his face inches from Corian's, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Sheriff Brawdy fumbled for the pistol at his hip, but Gus and Shorty stepped forward, their hands resting meaningfully on their own sidearms. The sheriff froze. The standoff was broken by a voice from the crowd. He's right, you know. An old rancher named Peterson, a man who had lost his own spread to Corian a year prior, stepped into the office. Corian did the same to me, offered me a loan when my wife was sick, bled me dry with interest, then took my land for pennies on the dollar.